Well, defining decisions. That's what we are talking about this September in this kind of short mini-series, if you will, in the midst of the book of Habakkuk. We're going to be talking about decisions that we, that we make that define really what happens next in not just in our lives, but in the lives of those around us as well. Decisions that go beyond, it goes to, into the lives of our friends, into the lives of our neighbors, our co-workers, those that we, classmates, everybody that we come into contact with. And as we continue to walk through this transformation that we see in the prophet Habakkuk, once more, as I did a couple of weeks ago, I stand here this morning really on the heels of another tragedy in our nation. Once more, we find ourselves at a place, similar to that of the prophet when he cried out to God, "How long?" You remember that? How long before you will do something? And once more, we are reminded, in stark clarity this last week of the lostness of the world around us, and the desperate need our world has for the transforming power of the gospel. And maybe after such a week as this, we will let God grab a hold of our hearts and break them. Perhaps today, we will allow God to take our perspective and shift it from ours to His, just as He did with the prophet. And maybe today we will commit ourselves to standing, as we have been talking about, standing our watch and seeing what God would say to us in the midst of it. And of course, what we will do in response to it. You see, even among those of us who call ourselves believers, our response to events like we have seen over this last week, events that that rise to the same level as those that the prophet was watching with his own eyes. Too often, our response is the same as his, where we just cry out to God and we want Him to do what we want Him to do. Right? We want God to do exactly what we have planned. And in our response, oftentimes we are limited, to not just our own perspective, but oftentimes our response is limited, or I should say, it is filled with our own anger in the midst of it. But if we are to be the people that God intended for us to be, if we are to be the ambassadors that He intended for us to be to a lost and dying world, then we must shift our perspective. It must change just as the prophet's perspective did. And that's where we'll dive into a little bit more this morning in chapter 2 and verse 1 of Habakkuk. Before we get to that, though, I want to just remind us that the pinnacle of this, the high point, if you will, of this entire message of Habakkuk isn't found until later on in chapter 2, where it says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge and glory of the Lord." Looking forward to a day when all will recognize, all will understand, that God is indeed, the Father of all. But in the midst of this transition that we see, of this transformation that we see in the prophet's life, it is in this verse, it is when he shifts from God's perspective to a place where he is willing to listen. That's where it all changes for the prophet. And this is where it can all change for us as well. "I will stand my watch," he says, "and set myself on the rampart, and watch to see what He will say to me, and what I will answer when I am corrected." Now, in the days of the prophet Habakkuk and those of ancient Israel, that kind of a statement would have immediately brought to mind a picture and an image that was a part of their everyday lives. In those days, they built walls around their cities and towns, not unlike that, only maybe just a little bit bigger than that. Of course, the bigger the city, the bigger the walls, the more they would surround it. They would build these towers alongside of these walls or in the midst of those walls, and whether it be day or night, they would set someone on top of those walls, on top of those towers, who would watch. That would be their job, to look out among the countryside and pay attention to what was going on. But this picture is one that is more than just a military one. It's more than just one that had security implications. Now, if we were to rewind back to the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 3, it says this. God is speaking to the prophet, and he says to him, "Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. Therefore, hear a word from my mouth and give them warning from me." That's the heart of what it means to be a watchman. A watchman is someone who stood, someone who watched, someone who paid attention to what was going on. His job was to simply proclaim to the people that he was standing watch on behalf of, to let them know what was happening and what was coming. Now, in the case of Ezekiel, he was he was to be the watchman for the people of Israel. He was their prophet. And while it's interesting, one of the things that's interesting about this is the weight that God puts not only on the prophet, but through the prophet lays them upon us even today. Listen to what he says as he continues on. He says, now this is God speaking to the prophet. He says, "When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his way to save his life, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity. But his blood I will require at your hand." What's interesting is that God goes on to say, or essentially says to him, if you do not perform your task, if you do not do what I have called you to do, if you do not proclaim what I have laid upon your heart to proclaim, then it is you who I will hold responsible in the midst of it. And yet he goes on to say this, and yet if you warn the wicked, and he does not turn from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall surely die in his iniquity. You notice that the offender, the one who is wicked, dies no matter what, right? I mean, he still faces his consequences. But the prophet, if the prophet warns him, if the prophet tells him, if he delivers the message that was given to him by God, then what God says is, you have delivered your own soul to the prophet. You see, the watchman is not the one who does the saving. It is not the task of the watchman to physically crawl down from the tower and go and physically protect the city. That was not his job. His job was to warn them. His job was to hear a message, was to see what was coming, and to deliver that message accordingly. You see, sometimes I think we get that mixed up. We think that it's the watchman's job to do everything. It was not. His job was to simply warn. If we were to go into the book of Ezekiel and fast forward from chapter 3 to chapter 33, we get another picture of this where God is reminding the prophet of his task. He says, "Son of man, speak to the children of your people when I bring a sword upon their land. That people of the land take a man from their territory and make him their watchman. When he sees a sword coming upon the land, if he blows the trumpet and warns the people, then whoever hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, if the sword comes and takes him away, his blood shall be on his own head." In other words, if the prophet warns, or in this case, if the watchman warns, and you're too busy, on your phone to pay attention, that there's an enemy coming, and you do nothing, that's your own fault. That's essentially what is said. But if the watchman sees the sword coming and does not issue a warning, does not blow the trumpet, and the people are not warned, and the sword comes and takes any, you notice he says that, takes any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood I will require at the watchman's hands. That's some pretty serious stuff, is it not? You see, the point of this is a reminder to the prophet of his task. A reminder to the one who would hear, the one who would listen and would, a reminder to hear and to listen and to then repeat it and lay it before the people. A reminder of his task. And I think if we would listen this morning, what we would hear from God through the prophet Habakkuk is a reminder of our task on days such as this. You see, as we turn our attention from Ezekiel, which provides for us a little bit of the foundation of all that would have gone through the prophet's mind and heart as he used this watchman language, not only would it have been familiar to him, but it would have been familiar to everyone that he spoke to or who read this afterwards. You see, what I believe happens in chapter 2 and verse 1, as the prophet makes that declaration, as he says, I will stand my watch. I will station myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me and what I will answer when I am corrected. I believe it is here where we see a shift in the prophet's heart. It's here where we see everything change within him. And I believe what happens is a shift in his perspective. Remember what has gone on so far? Remember the journey that we have seen so far? He starts off by looking out around him, looking at the nation before him, and he cries out to God. He wants God. Remember, we talked about how he wants God to do a very specific thing. And yet, what happens next is when God responds to him, when God says, I'm doing something. In fact, he says in chapter 1 and verse 5, he says, I'm doing something so amazing that if you were to look around and watch, if you were to be told this, you would not even believe it, even if I laid it out for you. In other words, he tells the prophet, I'm doing something that you couldn't even imagine. But listen, he says to the prophet, I'll give you a glimpse of it. I'll give you a taste of what is to come, of what I've been doing. And so that's exactly what God does. In the latter part, or the middle part, I guess, of chapter 1, he lays out for him a snippet of what he's going to do, of how he is going to use and bring the Babylonians to come and essentially bring judgment upon his own people. But you remember we talked about that a few weeks ago, didn't we? The prophet doesn't like God's perspective. The prophet doesn't like God's view of things. And so he tries to help God, change his perspective. Well, you remember? Well, he tries to kind of move God from his perspective to the prophet's perspective. But then at the end, at the beginning of chapter 2, this is where everything changes. So he's essentially argued with God. He's laid out what he wants to see. God has told him what is going to happen. And now the prophet comes to a defining decision in his life. Here is where everything changes. And the decision that he would make now would have an impact on everything else that would come. You see, I believe at this point, it is here where the prophet realizes, essentially he says this, in the midst of my own words, I realize that you know more than I do, right? Remember we talked about that you are God and I am not. He acknowledges that I don't see clearly as God Almighty sees. He realizes, just as Job did, that he wasn't God. Understands clearly that he sees with a warped perspective. And so he sets himself in a place intentionally and essentially declares, all right, God, I might not have it all right. I might not understand it all. I might not even like what you are starting to do, but I will stand here. I will station myself on a rampart, just as a watchman on a wall would, and I will listen to see what you're going to say. I will watch and see in the midst of all that you are doing what you will say to me so that I might respond appropriately, that I might relay that to those who are under my charge. Now, one of the most significant things that we see in this statement by the prophet is his assumption that he is going to have to change his mind. Did we catch that? You know, where he says at the very end, and what I will answer when I am corrected. And the implications of this are staggering if we step back and just think about it for just a moment. I wonder what would happen if we considered this even as we walked into doors such as these on a Sunday morning in a place just like this. You know, whether we walked in here, we're watching, watching this online somewhere. What would happen if we said, all right, God, whatever it is that you are going to say to me, whatever it is that you want me to hear this morning, I know that it is going to change my life. And I am willing not only to listen, but I am willing to change when you correct me. Could you imagine what God would do with us if we had that kind of a perspective when we walked into a place like this? I know we claim it. I know, we kind of say that, right? That we're going to church to hear God, to worship God, all of these things that we say, but we don't. We walk through these doors week after week after week, and we have no intention of changing anything. We have no intention of changing our perspective. Do you know how I know that? Because we're the same when we walk in the next week. We haven't done a single thing with what God has said to us. But what if we did? What if we set ourselves, as the prophet did, in not only a position to stand, but a position to watch? A position where we were intentionally listening to hear what God would say. What would happen if we assumed that the God of the universe had something to say to us? I mean, that's the kind of stance that changed the prophet's life. That's what happened inside of him and caused him, to be in a place where he was not only actually willing to hear, but he was willing to listen with his heart and do something with it. To do what God would lay before him. To be not only, hearers of the word, but doers of the word as well. He is committing himself at the front end of this to actually responding to what God is going to say. So imagine that. Imagine a place, imagine walking into a service like this where we were predisposed not only to listen, not only to hear, not only to understand that God is going to change our direction a little bit, where we will have to make a correction. But imagine what God would do if we actually committed ourselves. Okay, God, whatever it is that you will say to me, I will say yes at the beginning. That is a heart that God can use. That is a heart that God can take and use to turn a world upside down. But so often we walk in, we're thinking about, a shower this afternoon. We're thinking about a football game that we're going to watch this afternoon. We're thinking about all the horrific events that took place in our world this last week. We're thinking about everything and anything except that the God of the universe might have something to say to you. And I wonder. You see, as the prophet commits himself at the front end to actually responding, really, that's the whole point of this. That's the whole point. I mean, if we get one thing out of all of these messages that we will hear in the midst of this month of September, it is this. It's about these defining decisions. These decisions that we will make that have the potential to change everything. And it's about these decisions, this is what happened in the prophet's heart. This is what happened in the prophet's mind. And if we would grab a hold of these ourselves, everything in our lives would change just as it did in the prophet's life. As I think about this, as I come to this passage again, there's no real way for me to it just would take too long. We just don't have near enough time for me to explain on one Sunday morning the impact of this idea and this picture of standing watch and how much it has impacted my life over the years. This is how I seek to function. This is how I seek to not only function as an individual, but this is how I seek to function as a pastor. It has impacted everything that I do and how I look at things. You see, one of the ways that this impacts me is that we don't have to sit around and try and come up with ideas all on our own. How in the world are we going to reach the world around us? What's the plan that we're going to have? We don't have to do that. We don't have to look at the city around us and that has over 2 million people in it. We don't have to look at the almost 300,000 people who are within 15 minutes of where we are sitting even this morning. We don't have to rack our brains trying to figure out how are we going to do it. All we have to do is listen. That's all we have to do. Our task is to watch and see what God will say to us, and then all we have to do is respond. Then is where, if necessary, we change directions. You see, there, in the midst of that, if we follow that simple plan, we are assured of the outcome. Because it's not our plans. It's not our stuff that we're trying to do. We are just simply following Him. Now, granted, I would say this. I mean, from a very young age, I was infected with this idea. It was ingrained into me, this reality that God does this, that this is the pattern of how He works. That He speaks, and if we pay attention, then our job as believers is just to simply listen. It's to listen and then respond. And I mean, so often, so much of what we do in church, it's all about hearing, right? It's all about, getting some information. We don't talk a lot about response. We don't expect a response. And we certainly don't demand it of ourselves. But in the midst of all of these things that we do as Christians, as we come to church week after week after week, we make these things far more complicated than they need to be. All we need to do is listen to God and obey. That's all we need to do. We don't need to complicate it beyond that. But if our perspective is going to change, the first thing we need to do is to learn how to watch, isn't it? To learn how to listen, to learn how to pay attention to what God is doing all around us. If we are going to become watchmen, not only in our neighborhoods and in our families and our schools and our workplaces and the city in which we live, then we have to be a people who learn to watch, who learn to see. If we are going to tell a community all around us that we're watching them, we must learn how to do that. And that's what this month is all about, is learning how to watch. We need to learn to recognize what God is up to. And those are the things that we will explore in detail over the coming weeks. But here's one thing that I know absolutely for sure. You will never see anything that you are not looking for. If you're not paying attention, you are never going to see it. Think about it. I mean, it's a pretty simple concept, right? So if you don't put yourself in a place where you are able to see, and if you're not intentionally looking, then you're not going to see anything. But if we are watching, if we will keep our eyes fixed with an intention not only to see, but an intention to do something with it, then we will begin to see things that only God can do. We will begin to see the world around us from a different perspective, through a different set of eyes. I mean, consider the implications of this. I mean, it's staggering if we stop and allow it to really kind of settle in on us. If my job on a Sunday morning is to stand here and deliver interesting information from an ancient book, well, if my job instead of that is to stand here and deliver a message from the God of the universe to His people, doesn't that kind of level up the implications of that just a little bit? Doesn't that raise the stakes a little bit? I mean, did you come and gather here this morning to listen to my opinion on what God's Word says? Or did you come here this morning to hear what God might say to you? You see, the implications are staggering. Now, for me, it places a crazy weight on what I do on a Sunday morning. And I feel it every single week. But the weight is not mine alone. The weight is yours as well. Because there is also the implication of hearing it and responding to it. You see, once though that becomes a part of your life, you will find that it will become a natural reaction to everything that you do. You'll begin to see things that happen in your family. You'll see things that happen at school. You will hear somebody say something. You will watch what's going on in the news, and you will begin to ask the question, what is God doing in the midst of this? What might God do in the midst of this? How might God use us in the middle of this? You see, it becomes not just an evangelistic tool that looks forward to expanding the kingdom of God, but it becomes a way of life to such an extent that we come to the point where we are always watching, always listening, always listening, even for just that little whisper that God might say. And when He does, we are already predisposed to obeying what He says. That means when we walk in these doors on a Sunday morning or tune in anywhere in the world now, do you realize that when we do that, the God of the universe has something specific to say to you? That He has something specific to say to each of us. Have you ever stopped and tried to wrap your mind around that? You are not in this room this morning by accident. And the God of the universe has something that He would say to you. The question is, are you listening? I know you can hear my voice, but are you listening to God's in the midst of it? See, if we had that kind of a perspective, if we set ourselves in the same fashion as the prophet did on this day, it would change everything in our lives. How amazing is that to consider? That the God of the universe has set an appointment with you because He wants to say something that will dramatically and drastically impact your life. If only you would listen. If only we would put ourselves in a position to hear. We've started down that road because we're sitting here, right? We've started down that road because we have put ourselves in the midst of in a context where God's word is proclaimed. So we've already taken the first step. But are we listening to what God is saying in the midst of it? If only we would commit ourselves to watch the things that God would do. You see, we're talking about the kind of change in perspective such as the prophet Habakkuk had in our own lives that would radically change everything about how we lived. It would change, our lives would no longer be governed by our desires. They would no longer be governed by what we want to do next, but they would be governed instead by the hand of Almighty God. Isn't that just a little bit cool? To think of that? To think of the implications of that? So as we move a step closer to standing our watch in our communities, can we start this morning by just committing ourselves, deciding today that we will stand our watch? Decide to lift our heads, to open our eyes, to open our ears, and see what God might say to us. And I would say at times like these, especially at times like these, just as the prophet faced, do we not need God's perspective? You can turn on your television and watch the news, pick a channel. You can open your phones and you can look at social media, pick any one of those platforms, and you get enough of man's perspective. And some of us have spewed enough of our own perspective. Isn't it time we just stopped and listened for God's perspective? Listen to see what He might say in the midst of things. You see, it's times like these where we desperately need His voice. And we must be, at the outset, committed to adjusting our perspective to following His lead. Because don't you want to know what God is doing in the midst of it? Don't we want to know what God would say in the midst of the chaos of our nation today? If we would only stop with our own stuff at times like this, God just might be getting ready to do something in our midst, in our nation. The question is this: will we sit up and listen? Will we stand our watch? Do you suppose at a time like this, while so many of God's people, and I try not to get off on a rabbit trail, but where so many of God's people are fixated on the wrong things this week, do you suppose in the midst of this, God just might open up opportunities for the gospel to be injected into conversations where it might not have been the week before? Do you suppose He just might want to use Waypoint in the midst of that? Do you suppose He just might want to use you in the midst of that? Do you suppose your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, your relatives, do you suppose they might be just a little bit more predisposed to the gospel this week as they were compared the week before? You see, none of this matters if we're not watching. None of this matters if we're not paying attention. And it doesn't even matter unless we are predisposed to doing something with what God would set in front of us. And so that's my challenge this morning. That we would commit ourselves to making whatever adjustments we need to make so that we might hear what God would say and that we might respond when He does. You see, then, and only then, will we be able to walk through the chaos of the world in which we live with the kind of joy that Habakkuk ended with. You see, the call to be a watchman was not just for prophets of old. The call to be a watchman is not only for pastors of today. I believe the call to be a watchman is for every single one of us who would call Jesus Lord. Because is that not our ultimate purpose? To stand, to watch, to listen, and to respond. We could call it discipleship. We could call it obedience. We could call it a number of things. But I think the prophet would recognize it as a watchman. And so as we begin to look forward to communicating to the city around us that they're being watched, we must learn what that means so that we can watch what's going on in our neighbors' lives, in our families' lives, in our classmates' lives, and we can respond. You know, if we look back on this last week, from a young woman on a subway who no one helped, to remembering 24 years ago the events of 9/11, to what happened just a few days ago with Mr. Kirk. It has sparked especially the last one, it has sparked an outpouring of emotion across the spectrum, has it not? And all I can say as I thought through this and prayed through this is that something is wrong. Something is wrong when no one even placed a hand on a neck to stop the bleeding. Something is wrong when politicians smile and TV anchors proclaim that it is someone's fault for being shot. Something's wrong. Something's wrong when people celebrate the death of a young father and husband just because they don't agree with his opinion. Something's wrong when others use despicable language and threaten those who might say other things about Mr. Kirk or others. Something is wrong when we seem to be looking for somebody, well, to be angry at, instead of seeking to respond as God would have us respond. You know, if you are a follower of Jesus Christ, if you claim Him as Lord, you are His ambassador. And some of us have not represented Him well this week. And something's wrong. But why even bother? Oh, I struggled for 3 days, as to whether I should say anything or not, or how much or what. But it's true, we can't change the course in this room. We can't change the course of a nation. We can't. You and I can't force other believers into behaving in a civil fashion. I mean, we can't even make each other behave in a Christian fashion. We can't influence millions on social media, to stop with the nonsense. But what we can do is still significant. What we can do still matters. And maybe today, after such senseless violence and the reminder of 9/11 this last week, maybe today we catch a sense of what the prophet said at the beginning, like we hadn't felt before. Lord, how long shall I cry and you will not hear? He goes on to say, for the wicked surround the righteous, and therefore perverse judgment proceeds. Maybe after such a week, God will break our hearts. And maybe today we will allow Him finally to shift our perspective, just as He did with the prophet. Maybe today we commit ourselves to standing watch and seeing what God will say to us and what we ought to do in response. See, I think I might have said this before, but among believers, far too often our response is the same as the prophets. We have our agenda. We have our plan. We have our politics that we hold on to. And that's what we want God to do. But what if we allowed Him to change our perspective? Instead of us being angry with the world around us, what if our hearts were truly broken for the lostness that is right outside our doors? And cried out to God, okay, God, what would you have us do in response? How can we respond in the midst of this in a fashion and a way that you would have us respond? We're ambassadors if you claim Jesus as Lord. But shouldn't we be good ambassadors? In order to do that, we must shift our perspective. And if we would do that, even in the face of unspeakable evil There's no other way to describe some of the things that we have seen. We must look and see what God would say in the middle of it. And be ready to respond. Ready to see and ready to act when He lays an opportunity in front of us. See, it's at times like this where God seems to open up a crack in the hearts of people. And oftentimes, the gospel can slip in where it hasn't before. So can we set aside our own stuff? We all have political opinions. We all have our own opinions of Mr. Kirk and others involved. Can we instead just set that aside and say, God, how would you have me respond? More often than not, let me give you just a piece of practical advice. Just hit the delete on your Facebook. Stop it. Just stop. Because it's not helpful. You're going to argue with somebody you can't see. But instead, take that time. Lay your heart before God and say, what would you have me do? Stand with me, will you? Father, we